Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Don't Drink the Milk, It's Spoiled. Yeah. Okay. All right, and so I hope nobody minds, but I'm just going to serialize about as much of this commemoration speech as I can because there's just too much great material in it, and I'm having too much fun doing it, and so here we go with some more of that and the achievements of Alexander Dallas Bakke, picking up a little bit later in the speech than when we left off the other day. Have fun, guys. All right, so we're a bit later in the commemoration speech, right? And Benjamin Gould is going to pass over Alexander Bakke's translations of important recent physical and chemical memoirs, which did good in their day by bringing the newer results of science home to our doors, at a time when familiarity with modern languages was comparatively a rare accomplishment. And so now I've read this paragraph a few times now, and it continues to boggle my mind because what is he saying here? You know, how could familiarity with modern languages be a comparatively rare accomplishment in regards to science? What new languages are writing about science that need translation into English so that these newer results could be brought to our doors? You know, I would think that the modern languages of the day would be like German, English, French, Spanish, Latin. Latin would have been well established by this point. How hard would it be to take a scientific paper from German and translate it into English? Why is that a comparatively rare accomplishment? I don't get it. I don't understand what Gould is trying to say here. Maybe he's talking about Asiatic languages. I don't know. I think he's trying to say that there were hidden languages, and that these were what Alexander Bakke was good at translating and bringing us this new scientific knowledge, right? But he goes on, to state that he must comment on, for an instant, on the interesting and valuable results of his experiments on the correctness of measurement of rainfalls made by the ordinary gauges. Now, this is a really fascinating story, right? These observations were made in 1833, because of course they were, and although not published until 5 years later, when he communicated them to the British Association at its meeting in Newcastle, which he attended. So that would be in 1838. And so now these experiments were very labored and led to interesting deductions. Why hold on to these observations and findings for 5 years to present them at the British Association? What could you have been using this knowledge for in the interim, And so what the experiment was he placed rain gauges at each corner of Beck's shot tower in Philadelphia at a height of 162 feet from the ground. And so now this is interesting to me because Beck, of course, is just a variation of Bakke or Bach. How we talked about in Poe and, these spelling variations, they really kind of break down to the same families, and it's just regional dialect that has changed the spelling. And so, although I didn't go this far down that rabbit hole, I'm curious to see if there could be any family relation between whomever this Beck was and Alexander Bakke. And so secondly, I wanted to find out if this shot tower still exists. And it does. Right? This is Hidden City magazine, and this article is called Relieve the Monotony by going to visit the Beck's shot tower. And here it is, and I really like this picture because it's really kind of hard to age. Because this could be from, a wide range of eras. All right, so this is one of the first lead shot towers in the United States, opening in 1808. All right, it's the oldest standing industrial feature in South Philadelphia, as well as one of the last towers of its kind in the world. And we have one here in Baltimore, and someday I guess I'll be doing an episode on that soon, right? And so it says that towers like this revolutionized the making of musket and shotgun balls, based on the principle that molten lead will form perfectly round droplets while falling from up high. Firewood and lead were taken to the top of the tower, where a furnace was fired to melt the lead. Poured through perforations, the lead would spin into balls that hardened as they fell into pans of water on the ground. And so it's kind of curious to me that they would need or specifically specify this type of shape, for this task or activity of making shotgun and musket balls, right? That it would be tapered at the top and thin up here, to have a big furnace and a fire and to be melting this lead, in such close quarters, because this is really a very small space up here. And we're going to get to that in a second. Why couldn't they have done this from a more uniformly shaped structure? Why did it have to be tapered this way? That's kind of curious to me. All right. And so this particular shot tower was built by merchant Paul Beck, right, in late 1808. Right. And he built it resembling a small Washington monument. The obelisk. So it's an obelisk, they say. And now this is where that correlation comes in, because I've talked about this for the monuments in Baltimore here, how I feel that they were just at one time obelisks that they carved down or reshaped, knocked down, and put a statue on top of, kind of thing, right? So the shot tower originally resembled an obelisk, and now having this type of shape makes a whole lot more sense if you're repurposing an obelisk that was there, and you need to create a backstory for that. We would create giant fires at the top and drop molten lead 125 feet into water. All right, and so now this obelisk, as it first stood, it was 34 feet square at the bottom and 21 feet square at the top. At 166 feet high and with walls 6 feet thick at the base, the tower became a city landmark. And so tons of ammunition were produced at both of Philadelphia's shot towers during the War of 1812. It was said that they could provide enough ammo for all of America plus Asia. Did they understand did they understand at the time how huge Asia was? Right? And in 1815, to celebrate the end of the War of 1812, Beck's obelisk was lit up like a pillar of fire, the crown topped with 160 lamps. All right, so I wanted to think about this. It was lit up like a pillar of fire, right? The top crowned with 160 lamps. How big, what kind of lamps are we talking about here in 1815? They certainly didn't have electricity the way we know it today, right? And I know that this thing tapers off and that they gave dimensions of, and so this thing is 21 feet square at the top, right? And so now we're going to look at this again, tapers up 21 feet square. Now to do this, I kind of boxed it off to get, to see if I could figure out like the circumference of this. What I came up with is 21 feet square. If I were to do it in a square, it would be about 4.5 feet per side of the square, like 18 1/3 feet. All right. And so 160 lamps divided by 18 1/3 feet is about 8 3/4 lamps per foot. And so 8 3/4 lamps per foot makes each lamp 1 1/3 inches. So are we talking candles here? Or does somebody have to physically light them 126 feet above the ground? Or light them and then hang them? Or were we talking more like Christmas or tea lights here? I don't know, because these things would have to be smaller than an inch and 126 feet off the ground. What kind of technology did they have in 1815 that would mimic 3/4 inch Christmas lights around the top of Beck's shot tower? That is absolutely incredible. And so it was at this shot tower that Alexander Backy conducted his weather experiments, gauging the amount of rainfall at different heights. All right. And that's, I guess this is when it was still obelisk shape, because it said corners, right? He tied buckets to the 4 corners at 162 feet. And it says that this location was chosen because Philadelphia is situated upon an extensive plain where neither the falling rain nor the wind encountered purely local influences. So very little natural obstruction around Philadelphia here, right? And it says that the observations were made at first at 3 different heights. The original motive of the investigation having been to determine the extent to which the amount of rain collected is affected by the height of the station. It soon became manifest that the effect of eddy winds was greater than that of the difference of elevation, and Professor Backey himself became convinced that the variation in quantity of rain collected at different heights was chiefly due to this previously unsuspected source of error. So he didn't account for the wind? I mean, how is that? I mean, he's the smartest scientist around, right? How do you not account for the wind? The quantities of rain collected at the different angles of the tower varied very greatly, and in one extreme case, during a westerly wind, the quantity in the gauge at the southeast angle was 2 1/3 times as great as that in the northwest. In general, the leeward gauge received more than the windward one. And since the heavier rains generally fell in connection with certain particular directions of the wind, it is clear that averages derived from observations of these rains are liable to constant errors in the determination of the quantity of rain falling at a given height from the ground. Regarding the supposed variation in quantity as dependent upon variation in height, the results were far less marked, and although the temperature of the raindrops was often found higher than that of the air, he states that he never saw a case in which the gauges at the top of the tower showed more rain than those below. The extensive details of this research have not been printed. And so what the research shows is that depending on wind direction and how high off the ground you are really had an effect on how much water there was. Why would that information need to have such secrecy? Why would he need to keep that to himself for 5 years before he could get over to England and talk about this stuff? Right? Because the extensive details of this research have not been printed. It was far from Backey's usage to send his papers abroad for publication, but these results were, with entire propriety, communicated to the eminent foreign scientific body whose sessions he was attending, a welcome and honored guest. Speaking of them in later years, he says, "The experiments have never been published in extenso, because I thought the cream of them had been taken off, and there was no use for the skim milk." Kind of interesting metaphor, cream and skim milk here. Especially with Gould's feminization of science, right? Could this be mother's milk this cream and skim milk was made out of? But perhaps his need for secrecy, or at least his need to keep it quiet until he could get over to the Royal Society, was his work that he did with terrestrial magnetism, which was then made especially prominent as a field for physical investigation through the experimental and theoretical discoveries of Gauss and Weber. And unfortunately, I don't have time, but if anybody wants to get on them, I'm sure there's amazing things there, right? It says, as early as the year 1830, he had equipped a little magnetic observatory in the garden attached to his house, in which regular observations were made during a period of 4 or 5 years. Right? In his journeys, he carried with him portable instruments in which he determined the magnetic constants of the points visited. And I was thinking about this, okay, this is the 1830s. What kind of portable instruments did he have to determine the magnetic constants? And so I went looking to see if there was anything, and these are the only image really that came up in my search for portable scientific instruments that determine magnetic constants. And unfortunately, there's no scale on this thing, but to me, it looks like a pretty hefty piece of machinery. And so I can only imagine that if this is what they considered portable in the 1830s, that there was some poor schlub who had to carry this thing around for Alexander Backey from place to place, climbing up mountains and whatnot, right? It's unbelievable. And so what Alexander Backey accomplished in later years for his favorite branch of science, this terrestrial magnetism, the world knows. Makes me also wonder how much the world doesn't know, right? And it is certainly not too much. And it is certainly not too much to say that of what we know today of the distribution, intensity, and periodic and secular changes of terrestrial magnetism, we are indebted quite as much to Backey as to any other one man. Kind of says it all, right? How much more important can you get if you're indebted as much to him as to anyone else in this field? All right, so I'm not going to read all the details of his magnetic research here, right? There's just too much to get into, and maybe there'll be time later on, I don't know. But while I was reading it, it really just essentially goes over how he would measure and record levels of magnetic activity at different locations in North America, right? Going up mountains and this was a big part of his work with the Coast Survey, right? Essentially, his job was to chart a magnetic map of North America, right? Imagine what you could do as the originator of that knowledge, right? And the most important thing you can control is who you share it with, right? Do you share it with every one of your colleagues and pupils, right? Or do you keep some things to yourself, like maybe some magnetic hotspot or two, I don't know, right? Maybe you stumbled onto with your enormous genius, maybe you figured out how to connect your weather experiments with the weather experiments of your great-grandfather, right? And I'll try to remember to link this article, but yeah, Backy uses his great-grandfather's research on this, how storms move, right? And I'll try to remember to link this article. It's a really interesting story, and, there's going to be a few of these in the way there's just so much material in this commemoration speech. It's ridiculous. So maybe you and your big brain have figured out a way to connect your great-grandfather's research and your shot tower rain research and your terrestrial magnetism, and you figured out a way to control the weather, right? And my mind goes there because of a video I made about 2 years ago already, which is called Who Owns the Clouds? All right, September 11th, 2019. And in this video, I detail a weird weather pattern I had found floating around my Jubilee research. And they map out a plan for creating a system that could control the weather, right? A system that could be owned by a municipality. Everything from tying a wire belt around the planet to knocking it off its orbit, right? We should be able to control the weather by now, right? This editorialist believes. And since this is coming from the week of the Jubilee, and there's this tenuous connection between Alexander Backy and the McLean family, although Robert McLean would be killed off in the story by now here, but he was definitely a part of the setup, how we got to the Jubilee, right? And I do believe even more now than ever that the Baltimore Jubilee of 1906 is the true marking point of transition from one era to another, from the old into the new, right? And the narrative is telling me that this transition wouldn't have been possible without Alexander Backy. It just wouldn't be possible. And so, I have to take this commemoration speech one incredible story at a time. So, so with that, just remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the next one, cheers.